Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Godly Gambit, which is a line in the Caro-Kann defense, which starts out with e4 and c6. Now, play typically continues with d4, d5, and then after the pawn takes on d5, usually white would capture on d5, but instead, black's going to play knight to f6, offering up an additional pawn here on c6. We are going to be looking at the accepted, just the pawn takes on c6. Black recaptures on c6. So you can see anytime you're gambling material, you're trying to gain an advantage, whether that's a tempo, a strategic, any of those. In this case, it's just time. How quick we are getting our pieces involved into the action. You can see the queen and the knight are both attacking the pawn on d4. So pretty common now for white to play knight f3. Simple development move, defending this pawn on d4. And black has two options. One is to play bishop g4, pinning down the knight, getting the light square bishop involved into the game. And the other is to play e5. I think both are fine and have their own merits. I do think e5 allows for some trickier positions that white can get into. And I'm always trying to find lines where white is in a tougher spot. So I think e5 is the play. And from here, white has three different options that we're going to be covering today. Yes, they can play some other things, but we are going to be looking at the pawn taking on e5. We're going to look at the bishop coming to b5, pinning down our knight. And then we're also going to be looking at the knight taking on e5. So the first variation we're going to look at is the pawn takes on e5. This opens up for the queens to come off the board, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take with our queen. The king captures, and then we're going to play knight to g4. Now, this knight on g4 is attacking the pawn on f2, and you can see that would be a fork, attacking both the king and the rook on h1 here. And white has a couple ideas on how they can defend this. One, since they've already moved their king, that they're not worried about moving the king again because they can't castle. They can't castle anyway because they moved their king to take our queen on d1. So they could come back to e1. I don't think that's as good of a move because that now blocks off the rook coming to the e file, which they potentially may want to do, and it doesn't get any other piece involved into the action. We'll look at another move, and that's bishop to e3. It also defends the pawn on f2 and gets more material involved into the game. But king to e1, they could try. If that's the case, we can just add more pressure to that square with bishop to c5. Again, since we're down in material, we want to make sure we're getting more material involved into the game and we are on the attack, especially if you're going to give up your queen. That's typically a very, very powerful piece in an attack when you're down in material. So once that's off, you have to even be more aggressive than you were before. So the knight and the bishop both attacking the pawn on f2. I think they pretty much have to play bishop to e3. We can exchange, and now we can play knight takes e3. We are still down a pawn in material. So white has 6 pawns, black has 5 pawns. We can start to attack this pawn on e5. Yes, they have a defender right now with their knights, but we can castle on the king side if we want to. We can castle on the queen side, really start to put pressure on this pawn. It will be difficult because it is an isolated pawn for white, meaning they don't have a pawn on the f or the d file to support this. So it will be difficult for them to hold on to this. We are also threatening with the move knight to e3. We're threatening this knight takes on c2. This is another fork attacking the king and the rook. And so more than likely they play knight to a3, which does defend it, but also this is not where white wants their knight. This is not involved into the game. And so we're able to develop even more material, preparing to castle on the queen side. And so this should give us ample exchange for being down a pawn in material. Now, if they don't play king d1, because I don't think king to e1 is the play to defend the pawn on f2, I think bishop to e3 is the play. Again, still defends that pawn on f2 and stops black from playing the bishop to c5. In this case, we can go ahead and take the bishop. The pawn takes, and now we can get our light square bishop involved into the game. We can castle on the queen side. And so while it looks a little bit different, you can still see that although we're down 2 pawns in material, we are going to be able to chip away and start to attack these two isolated pawns on the e-file, but it's going to be a longer term vision. So that is if the pawn takes on e5. The next thing we're going to look at is if they play bishop to b5, which makes sense, getting another piece involved into the game, pinning down our knight in case we want to use that, and just stop some of the threats that we have. Now, in this case, I think the best play is to play bishop to g4. Hey, you want to pin down our knight? We're going to pin down your knight as well. From here, I think you'll typically see three things. One is the pawn taking on e5. I think you also may see the bishop taking on c6. Anytime you're up in material, it makes sense usually to just exchange down as much as possible. Reaching to the end game, if you have a material advantage, usually is a good thing. So just taking material, forcing us to exchange and giving us an isolated pawn on the c file. And then lastly, just knight c3, getting more material involved into the game. Is usually something that one side may want to do. So after bishop g4, first thing we'll look at is the pawn takes. Okay, which you can probably imagine, as soon as they take that, we are going to exchange on d1, and then we're going to castle on the queen side. This does check our opponent, and so while we don't have great king safety, because both the pawns on the d and the c file are gone, we don't need as much safety as we typically would when the queens are on the board. You can be a little more aggressive in how you have your king involved than you do if the queen's are involved. But really, we're just looking for a faster approach to get our rook to d8 while also opening up for our other rook to get involved into the game. Because yes, we could just bring our rook to d8, but also this allows us to bring our rook at some point to the center of the board, and it just does multiple things by castling on the king side. Now, they could block it with bishop d2. Then we take that material on e5, and now we don't have to worry about that pin from the bishop on b5. They can't move their knight because the pins are a little bit different, and if they move their knight, then that would be an illegal move, so they can't do that. So that's what happens if they take with their pawn on e5. They also could just exchange here on c6. Okay, we have to take, so it's a little bit different than before. If they take with their pawn on e5, which we'll look at maybe if they just castle, but if they take, that's going to be similar as before. We castle on the king side. Maybe if they do this now, we come back to d7. We just have a different setup than before, but this now allows us to add more pressure on this e5 square. We can also just come to e8 if we want to. We can get our dark square bishop involved into the game. They may not take on e5 in this position. They could decide, you know what, hey, things are fine right now. We're up in material by one pawn. We have good structure with the center, so let's just go ahead and castle. Usually if people are going up against the gambit, they want to make sure that their king is safe. Well, in this example, we're just going to go ahead and take on d4, but then we can go ahead and exchange on f3. If they exchange down here, we can go ahead and take with our knight, or excuse me, our rook on d8. They take on f3, and you can see we're going to have to chip away on these pawns on the f file. The f3 pawn is definitely weak, and it's going to be difficult for them to hold on to this, but we don't have a ton of additional threats. So this, I think, is fairly good for white going into the endgame just because they don't have to worry about a ton. Yes, we're going to get our dark square bishop involved into the game. We can potentially castle on the king side, but not as many threats as I would typically like when I'm playing a gambit. The last thing we're going to look at is if they don't take on c6, instead they play knight to c3. In this case, I recommend just pushing forward with e4, and then if they castle on the king side, we can exchange on f3. I think they push forward with d5. That's attacking a pin piece, which is usually what you want to do. A knight's being pinned down by the bishop to the king. We cannot move our knight on c6 because that would be an illegal move. And so maybe we play a6, attacking a bishop. Now rook to e1. We play bishop to e7, preparing to castle on the king side. So a little bit different setup. When they play knight c3, we're usually not castling on the queen side of the board and exchanging queens. Instead, we're going to play a different structure. So that is what happens if they play bishop to b5 early on. The last variation we're going to look at is if they just decide to take with their knight on e5. Now, from white's standpoint, I think this is one of the better options. So if you're playing this as white and you run into this, I think taking on e5 is definitely a good play here. Now, there's a couple options that black has. I think the most logical one for them is just to take with our queen on d4, forces the trade on d4. We take with our knight on d4. You can see that we're threatening the pawn on c2, forking the king and the rook. White's usually going to play bishop to d3. I say usually because they could play some terrible move that does not end up being the same situation. Just know that I'm showing what's typically the best move or the main line. If you see something different, there's usually something going on and you can take advantage of that. In this case, we can play bishop to f5, trying to just blow that up. If they take, we can take back here on f5. But then if they play knight to c3, it's difficult, in my opinion, to really get a big advantage from black. Yeah, we could just come back with knight to d4, attacking that pawn, but then they could just play king d1. They don't have to worry too much with the queens off the board as far as castling is concerned. You know, from black's standpoint, yes, we can castle if we wanted to at some point. Probably not going to right now. Need to hold on to the f7 pawn. But yeah, we can castle at some point. We can get our dark square bishop involved into the game. Castle on the king side if we really want to. But all in all, I think it is going to be difficult for black to really have a strong advantage once they take our e-pawn. The e-pawn is just a huge asset in this gambit from black. So that is an overview of the Godly Gambit. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Definitely try it out and let me know what you think. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I will see you in the next one.